Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to Jane Austen July. So today, hopefully when this is going up, is the 1st of July, is the start of Jane Austen July, which is very exciting. So I thought, in celebration of Jane Austen July, today I would give you some tips and tricks, some do's and don'ts for reading books by Jane Austen. So, if you don't know what Jane Austen July is a month-long readathon that takes place every July, hosted by me, by Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and by Claudia from the Spinsters Library. Basically, Jane Austen July is a month-long celebration of all things Jane Austen and related to Jane Austen. We have challenges, we have read-alongs. I'll leave the announcement videos and our TBRs down below if you want to find out more. But today I thought I would kick off Jane Austen July by making a video with some tips and tricks, some do's and don'ts for reading Jane Austen. So I did this back in October for Charles Dickens, and people seem to really enjoy it and find it quite helpful, so I thought I would do the same for Jane Austen, and maybe I'll do the same for some other authors in the future. So if there's any other authors you would like some advice for going into, such as maybe Thomas Hardy. I might do one for Thomas Hardy this October. Anyway, let me know down in the comments if you have any requests of authors to do some tips and tricks, some do's and don'ts for. Basically, I've pulled together 10 pieces of advice for going into reading Jane Austen. If you are a hardened Jane Austen fan who loves Jane Austen very much, then this might be fun and interesting for you, but it's probably not going to be that useful. I think this is probably sort of more for people who are relatively new to Jane Austen, either haven't read Jane Austen before, feeling a bit daunted by Jane Austen, or have read like one or two Jane Austens but don't really know where to go next. Hopefully this might be a useful video for that kind of person. Or someone who has tried Jane Austen and is sort of struggling to get into Jane Austen. One thing I will add as well before I begin is that I feel like Jane Austen needs do's and don'ts less than Charles Dickens does. Like, I feel like Charles Dickens is a more daunting author to get into than Jane Austen, but hopefully these tips will still be useful nonetheless. So, number one, don't be afraid. Jane Austen's books are really quite accessible. As classic authors go, I would say that Jane Austen's books are pretty easy to get into. Her writing isn't too fiddly, her novels aren't that long, and her plots tend to be like less convoluted and a bit more straightforward than some other classic authors. Even just simply the fact that Jane Austen's chapters tend to be pretty short is helpful for getting into Jane Austen as a beginner. Like I said, I do feel that Jane Austen is a much easier author to get into than Charles Dickens or Thomas Hardy. I feel like her books are quite approachable, so go into Jane Austen knowing that although she is a classic author, she is a fairly accessible, approachable classic author. Yes, her books are more than 200 years old, but that doesn't mean they are inaccessible. They are well worth your time, and they are relatively easy to get into. Tip number two, do start with Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's best known novel for a reason. It is fantastic, and it is a book that I feel like nearly everyone who reads it likes it. It is one of those books that in general, you're probably going to like. It is a wonderful, wonderful novel, great love story, lots and lots of good characters, really fun family dynamic, and you probably will know the plot a little bit, at least from popular culture. You'll know who the important characters are, so it's a sort of easier one to get into. I really recommend starting with Pride and Prejudice. I'm firmly of the opinion that it is the best place to go first with Jane Austen. Also, if you have in your head an image of Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice from popular culture, it's not 100% accurate, but Pride and Prejudice will give you the best, version of the idea you have in your head of popular culture of Jane Austen, if that makes sense. And it is a truly wonderful book. It has a great love story, but it's also very, very funny, and it's just very accessible. Pride and Prejudice is, in my opinion, 100% the place to start with Jane Austen. But tip number three is don't expect a big, grand love story in every novel. Lots of people go into Jane Austen sort of expecting pure romance, because that tends to be how the films or television adaptations of Jane Austen books are marketed. I feel like the role Jane Austen has in popular culture is as a writer of sort of great love stories, and that is true. Like, some of her books are fantastic love stories, and she does write love stories really well, but that's definitely not all her books are about, and some of her books are much more love stories than others, so you might find yourself a little bit disappointed in some of her novels if you go in expecting love stories to be sort of the main thing her books are about, if that makes sense. I'm going to make a video at some point later in Jane Austen July talking about whether or not Jane Austen's books are love stories and which of her books are love stories. But basically, in my opinion, Pride and Prejudice, Emma and Persuasion are, at their heart, love stories. but the rest of Jane Austen's books are doing a lot of other things, and actually the love story, while there, is just one element. And actually, if you read her other books, apart from the three I just mentioned, and you're looking for a great love story, you might find yourself a little bit disappointed. So I think it's really worth going into Jane Austen's books, especially once you get beyond sort of Pride and Prejudice. It's really worth going into her books, being aware that love stories are not the only things going on, and if you're looking for a big grand romantic ending, then not all of her books have that. While all of her books do contain some kind of love story, or at least some kind of marriage plot, some of them are much more heavy on the romance than others, and her books are also coming-of-age stories, books about money, and just books about women's lives in general. There's a lot of other things going on in her books, and I think that's worth keeping in mind as you're going into Jane Austen. Tip number 4 is do try all of Jane Austen's books, including Lady Susan. So Jane Austen wrote 6 books that are considered her main novels, and then she also wrote a novella, a finished novella called Lady Susan, which is fantastic as well. And they are all really, really well worth your time. I do think there are quite a lot of people who have read Pride and Prejudice and maybe Sense and Sensibility, but then haven't read more widely in Jane Austen's work. And actually all 7 of her books, if we're including Lady Susan, are fantastic, and I really recommend them. A lot of Jane Austen's novels do have things in common. There are themes she returns to, but her novels are also quite different from each other. So depending on the kind of person or reader you are, and depending on the kind of book you like, you might find you like some Jane Austen books more than others. As I said, I really do recommend starting with Pride and Prejudice, but after you've read Pride and Prejudice, then if what you're looking for in Jane Austen is sort of the love story element, then Persuasion or Emma, I think, are the best ones to read. If you're after a coming-of-age story, then I recommend Northanger Abbey. If you're after something really funny and what you like best in Jane Austen so far is the humour, then Emma or Northanger Abbey or Lady Susan would be the way to go, in my opinion. If you really enjoy the sibling relationships in Pride and Prejudice, and you want to read a book about sibling relationships, then Sense and Sensibility is a great one to try. And if you like the social criticism best, and you're really interested in the history of the time period when Jane Austen was alive, then Mansfield Park is the one to go for. In general, I would say that Mansfield Park is best saved till last. I love Mansfield Park hugely. It's my second favourite Jane Austen after Pride and Prejudice. I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's very underrated. But it is a Jane Austen book that a lot of people struggle with, partly because the love story in it isn't necessarily like the heart of the book, partly because the main character, Fanny, is a little bit more timid and a little bit sort of more internal and passive, I suppose, though I also think she's a great character with a lot of moral strength. But anyway, but a lot of people struggle with Mansfield Park, so I would recommend leaving Mansfield Park till last, maybe unless you are really interested in social criticism and you really sort of love the history of this time period of the early 19th century. If you are really after the social criticism and the history stuff, then Mansfield Park is great because it's fascinating from a historical perspective and the social criticism in it is amazing. But in general, I would say that Mansfield Park is best saved till the end because a lot of people struggle with it, so it's a good one to read once you know and love Jane Austen and you know what you like in Jane Austen and you can appreciate Jane Austen a lot. Then you will like Mansfield Park more. Mansfield Park is a Jane Austen book that the first time I read it, I was like, oh, this is a bit boring. And then the second time I read it, I was studying at university and I was like, oh no, this is one of the best things ever written. It's fantastic. So yes, tip number 4, do read all of Jane Austen's books. Tip number 5 is do bear with a slow opening or two. Like many novels from the 18th and 19th centuries, Jane Austen's books sometimes take a little bit of time to get going. I would say that Jane Austen often has a great first sentence, but it usually takes like a few chapters to get into the heart of the story and sometimes even to get to the centre of the main characters. So for example, at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, we have the wonderful first line, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. But then we have lots of discussion between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and we have sort of general scenes with the sisters before we focus in on Elizabeth Bennet as our heroine. It takes a little bit of time for it to become sort of clear in the novel, who is at the heart of the book, I suppose. And in some of her other books, there is a chapter of sort of family history and background before we get into the plot. So it's sort of worth being aware that some of her books do take a little bit of time to get going, and a bit of time for sort of setup. I still really like the openings of her books, but I feel like sometimes we feel a little bit slow at the beginning, but do bear with her books. They will grip you later on when the story really gets into the swing of things, I promise. Tip number 6 may seem slightly random, but I'll explain what I mean. But don't forget that Jane Austen isn't a Victorian. So A lot of people, like I did, come to Jane Austen through reading other books from 19th century Britain, and the majority of literature that is sort of well known from 19th century Britain is Victorian literature published between 1837 and 1901. But Jane Austen was writing a few decades before those authors. She died 20 years before Queen Victoria came to the throne. I feel like there used to be a very big misconception that Jane Austen was Victorian. I feel like that is probably slightly less the case now than it was like 5-10 years ago, because of the sort of recent interest in like Regency history and Regency culture and Regency romance and historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. Basically, I wanted to talk about this because I feel like if you do come to Jane Austen through reading later 19th century British literature, you know, the Brontes or Dickens or Anthony Trollope, then Jane Austen's style and plot structure is quite different. I always think of Jane Austen as a sort of bridge between 18th century literature and Victorian literature. She has a lot more character development in her novels than is present in a lot of 18th century literature, but also her sort of plot structure and style is a bit different from writers writing later in the 19th century. Also, the historical context of the Regency period is quite different from the historical context of the Victorian period. Also, the historical context of the Regency period is quite different from the historical context of the Victorian period. Social customs and things were different, technology was different. Through a lot of the time that Jane Austen was writing and publishing her books, the Napoleonic Wars were happening. Like, there's a lot of different social and historical contexts going on in the time Jane Austen was writing in comparison to the Victorian period. So I think it's quite useful going into Jane Austen to know that she is writing about a slightly different time period than other very famous British classics, which are from later in the 19th century. Tip number 7 is don't worry too much if you miss small details. This is kind of the same sort of advice that I give to everyone going into any kind of classic. I think often because people have studied classics at school or university, they go into reading a book from the past thinking, this is a really important book, I must study it and analyse it. And actually, if you do that, then you don't have as much fun as you might have if you just went away and read it. Jane Austen is one of those writers who is very subtle and has a lot of small details. Even though she is working very hard to do small things, the small things all build up into big things that you will get. So even if you don't pick up on all the small things, Jane Austen is a very skilled writer, so you'll pick up on enough of them that you will understand what she's trying to say. One of the reasons why I love rereading Jane Austen's books is because she's very subtle and because she's very detailed and because her characters are all really complicated and have lots of layers. But if you read a Jane Austen book for the first time and you don't pick up on every little single intricacy, that is absolutely fine. You're still probably going to have a good time. As I recommend with all classics, just go in and enjoy the ride. Don't worry if you don't understand something. Don't worry if you think you've missed a detail. Just enjoy it. And kind of leading on from that, tip number 8 is don't forget to have fun. Jane Austen's books are massive, massive fun. Yes, the love stories are really fun, but also her books are absolutely hilarious, and the social critique and the satire in her books is just glorious. I find Jane Austen so funny. Jane Austen, for me, is one of the funniest writers there has ever been, and if you go into Jane Austen expecting, like, polite, serious fiction, that is not exactly what Jane Austen was doing. Yes, there are polite and serious moments, and yes, there are grand romantic moments, and yes, there are sort of sad, complicated moments, and yes, there's social criticism, but also Jane Austen is just hilarious, and there's a lot of very silly characters, there's a lot of very mean characters who are quite entertaining to read about, and her books are just a complete joy to read. So go into Jane Austen ready to have fun, wanting to have fun. She's not always being serious. A lot of moments in her books are supposed to be silly and ridiculous. Have fun with them. Jane Austen is such great fun to read. My last 2 tips are actually the same as my last 2 tips in the Dickens video that I did last year, and I think they're good tips for reading any kind of classic or getting into any new classic author. Tip number 9 is do try an audiobook. Jane Austen's books are really great on audiobook because, as I just said, Jane Austen is very funny, then that makes them great on audiobook. Also, she has a lot of characters and that works well on audiobook. Also, her chapters are often very short, which is also really nice on audiobook. Like the Rosalind Pike audiobook of Pride and Prejudice, which is one of my favourite audiobooks. I listen to it a lot. I think most of the chapters are sort of between 10 and 20 minutes, some of them even shorter than that, which is really nice because you can just read it in like little bite-sized chunks. And there are a few other things as well about the way Jane Austen writes which work really well on audiobook. One of the ways that Jane Austen sometimes characterises her silly characters is that they have very long speeches where they talk nonsense for a long period of time, which when you're reading it can be a little bit frustrating, but on audiobook audiobook is very, very funny. So for example, if you've read Emma, there is a character in Emma called Miss Bates, and Miss Bates regularly talks for like 4 pages, and when you're reading it, you're like, will Miss Bates ever be quiet? But when you're listening to an audiobook, you get the full effect of like someone who will just not stop talking, and it's really, really fun, and it gives Miss Bates such characterization. So audiobooks work really well for Jane Austen using those kind of tools, I suppose. And another thing that works really well on audiobook is Jane Austen's use of free indirect discourse. So free indirect discourse is a marvellous tool in writing that Jane Austen uses a lot, where still remaining in third person in prose, she kind of like inhabits the character's voice a little bit. So as the narrator, as the author, she is phrasing what she's saying in the way that one of her characters might phrase it. And good audiobook narrators of Jane Austen sometimes put these bits like slightly into the voice of that character, or give them the same intonation that they give when that character's speaking. So the way Jane Austen uses free and direct discourse is sometimes clearer when you're listening to Jane Austen on audiobook. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. Tip number 10 is do try an adaptation. If you're struggling to get into Jane Austen, then it is absolutely fine to watch a film or TV adaptation first. There are a lot of very fantastic film and TV adaptations of Jane Austen. I will leave a link down below to a video I made a few years ago talking about my favourite adaptations of Jane Austen. I feel like I might have made that video before the 2020 film of Emma came out, so I would just like to add that recommendation into the mix because that's great as well. In general, if you watch a film or television adaptation of a Jane Austen book, you'll get the basic outline of the story, and then you can go into the novel knowing what's happening, but also like picking up on smaller details that you might have missed if you were worrying about following the plot. As I've already mentioned, some of the TV and film adaptations sort of lean more into the love story than necessarily the books do, but they still should give you a decent overview of the plot, which can help you going into a Jane Austen book. So there we go, those are my 10 tips, my 10 do's and don'ts for reading Jane Austen. I hope this list has been useful. Please do let me know down in the comments if you have any other tips or tricks for reading Jane Austen, and also if there are any other authors you would like me to make one of these videos for in the future. Welcome to Jane Austen July. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.